Welcome to Amir Shakil 5858, the War and Love Report. I am Amir Goodnam. According to weather expert or meteorologist, July has been the hottest temperature in the record. But don't worry, Americans, some relief is coming and it's on the way. More than 100 million Americans are under the heat wave alert today. The United States is very large, so different parts have the different kind of weather these days. Having said that, the parts of the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic and Northeast temperatures are feel like between 100 and 110 due to the heat and humidity. The boiling point in America is city of Phoenix, where for last 30 days the temperature is consistently more than 110 degree. But a prediction of rain on weekend could break this streak. Northeast will be cooled down after arrival of a cold front from the north in coming week. But the South will have at a dinner in Iowa. Mr. Trump says that the charges against him and the investigation that could lead to more charges have a political smell. Other Republican candidates didn't even mention the name of Mr. Trump, who spoke on this dinner in Iowa. But there is always one who jolts the audiences. In this case, Texas former Congressman Will Hurd said that Donald Trump is running for presidentialship because he wants to stay out of prison in Iowa dinner. But the Russian missiles struck eastern Ukraine. There are 2 deaths are reported in Zaporizhzhia today. In city of Dnipro, Russia targeted a building which killed injured 9 people, including 2 children. Russia is also targeting infrastructure of grain shipping and today hit a grain terminal in southern city of Heshan. There is a good news from medical field. There is a promising new way to stop up spread of some sexually transmitted infections and uses an old drug, the cheap and widely available antibiotic. Maria Lopez of PBS News Weekend says that
a morning after pill for sexually transmitted infections. A single dose of the antibiotic doxycycline taken in the hours immediately after sex could stop bacterial STIs like chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis. It's a potential game changer in the fight against sexually transmitted infections, one that's more urgent now with the sharp rise in cases over the last decade. But some health officials are raising concerns that wider use of the preventative antibiotic could breed drug resistance. For more on the preventative strategy,
according to Fanit Nirapil, the Washington Post reporter.
So it's doxycycline, which is a common antibiotic, and it's used as a post-exposure prophylaxis. So the idea is that if you administer this antibiotic, and if someone takes the pills up to 72 hours after having sex, it can reduce their chances of contracting a bacterial STI like chlamydia, syphilis, and gonorrhea.
And so STIs.
Health officials have been saying they really need new tools. Promoting condoms, promoting abstinence, it can only go so far. And so they've been looking for medical interventions as well. Really, the big hope is getting something like a vaccine, but there hasn't really been much progress on that front. So something like DoxyPep gives you an option to get it to the highest risk populations. And then if people who are at the highest risk for STIs aren't getting it, you stop the chains of transmission early, and then you can prevent broader circulation of STIs. So those were the populations that were studied in the research that found doxypep effective. And the reason you're looking at gay men, or more precisely, men who have sex with men and trans women, is because rates of STIs are higher in that group. And I also want to be clear, one of the reasons here is not just because of differences in sexual behavior, but because when you have a smaller pool of people and a smaller pool of sexual partners, when one person has an STI, it's easier for that STI to spread. So the idea here is that they want to limit doxypep to people who are at highest risk, because doxypep, as you mentioned earlier, can also have unintended consequences, and that's because it's an antibiotic. In the medical profession, you want to try and limit the use of antibiotics because it can lead to drug resistance, both for individuals and for the population as a whole. So the argument is that if you're using an antibiotic like doxycycline dozens of times a year, you can be facilitating the rise of drug-resistant superbugs, because as the bacteria that cause diseases like syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia are circulating, you might facilitate the evolution of bugs that can overcome antibiotics like doxycycline. And then you might have a situation where people are contracting strains of these bacteria and the frontline treatments are no longer effective. And that's at the population level. At the individual level, there's also a worry that using antibiotics regularly can make it harder for that antibiotic to be effective when you're sick with other issues. Or it might harm your gut microbiome health, because there are healthy bacteria in our systems too that promote good health, and an antibiotic like doxycycline can really wipe that bacteria out. And that's one of the really important issues here. So doxycycline is not a new morning after pill. It's an old pill that just has a new use. This antibiotic is used for Lyme's disease. It's used for long-term acne treatment. It's used for malaria prevention. And so some of the promoters of doxycycline as a STI prevention say that it's being held to an unfair standard. And they're also wondering here, part of the discomfort is that this is really for gay sexual health. And because it allows people to have sex without condoms without having to worry as much about STIs. The concern here is, are doctors being hesitant to help people avoid STIs because they see the antibiotic as unnecessary? Because people who work in the sexual health field says we have to acknowledge a reality that not everyone is going to wear condoms. And condoms also aren't 100% effective against STIs, especially if you're not wearing them consistently or properly. So in the sexual health field, you have a real demand for alternatives to condoms and abstinence, but in the broader medical field, you have a real concern about antibiotics. And the CDC is actually drafting guidelines for how to distribute doxypep right now, and that's the exact kind of conundrum that they're trying to address. How do you deal with the problem of rising STIs, and how do you also avoid the problem of antibiotic resistance and making it worse?
French actress Maria Schneider was launched into the spotlight when she was 19 years old. This happened when she appeared in Last Tango in Paris with Marlon Brando, a classical. This movie made her a superstar. Vanessa Schneider, a cousin of Maria Schneider, has published a book in her name. The book name is My Cousin Maria Schneider. When I asked Vanessa Schneider why she wrote this book, she replied,
When I was a child, I was fascinated by this cousin, Maria Schneider, who was very famous in France and in the world at the time. Not necessarily for good reasons, but for this scandalous film, Last Tango in Paris. So she was my cousin, but she was also a bit of a star. I admired her a lot, and at the same time, I felt she was very fragile, and I had a desire and a need to protect her. Maria was older than me. I am a journalist, but I had already written novels, and Maria told me one day that she'd like to tell her version of things, since she had already said in interviews that she had been abused in the famous scene in Last Tango in Paris, this scene of sodomy which had not been written in the script. She wanted to say what kind of woman she was, what kind of actress she was beyond the scene in Last Tango, and she wanted me to write a book with her. But in the end, she was a little afraid to do the book. And when she died in 2011, I said to myself, it's my turn to tell this story, which isn't the book she would have written alone necessarily, it's my perspective too, it's the perspective I had as a child. I also wanted to tell the story of the woman she was, the cousin she was to me, the girl she was in private, very funny, sometimes difficult, and who had a very adventurous life. It's also about our family. The Schneider family was not an ordinary family, and she suffered a lot because she wasn't protected by her parents. So I wanted to tell the story of who she was as a whole.
Dans son ensemble.
The film made her well known, but at the same time it was a real curse for her. It was a curse because she felt raped and abused, and at the same time she was seen as dirty by the public. The film was banned in many countries, and she was never able to shake that image. And after the film release and the scandal that followed, she fell into drugs, heroin in a very bad way, and those years were terrible for her. She had a lot of trouble coming back from that.
I asked Vanessa if her first role had been different from the one she did in Tango in Paris. Would her life would be different? Vanessa replied,
I think Maria would have done cinema anyway. Would she have had personal difficulties? Maybe yes, because she had her fragile points. She was someone who had a very complicated childhood with a mother who was not loving and with a father she only met at the age of 16 or 17, who took her to nightclubs and introduced her to drugs and didn't take care of her like a father. So she was someone who maybe wasn't strong enough for the world of cinema as it was at that time.
"Thank you, Vanessa Schneider, for your comments and your time." Former President Mr. Trump is leading a big rally in Erie, Pennsylvania right now. His supporters are chanting and dancing and calling Mr. President, Mr. President. I asked a supporter what he thinks about the legal charges against Mr. President Trump, former President Trump. The supporter says that they don't believe for a minute. Trump is it, he is it. They says after God there is a Trump. In the rally, Trump said about the charges,
"These are ridiculous indictments, and all they're doing is hoping for massive election interference. That's all they want to do."
in Iowa dinner last night, no Republican presidential candidate talk about Mr. Trump, but only the former congressman of Texas said this.
Donald Trump is running to stay out of prison. And if we elect Mr. Trump,
Mr. Trump is leading with a big margin in this race of primary. Arizona Police Department has issued an edited body cam video footage which shows that the police officer are rescuing a toddler who was being drowned in backyard pool. Police officers used infant CPR to revive the child, and it did revive. The family highly appreciated the police officers' function during an emergency, which saved their life. This is the first part of today's news. Second part is following. I am thankful to all news resources for their continuous cooperation. I am also thankful to the viewers for their privilege of time. Have a good night.